These are two PS3 controllers. They look the same, but in reality, one of these is considered Sony's worst controller in their lineup, and you only have to turn them 90 degrees to see why. That's right, we're talking about the PS3 Sixaxis controller today and why pretty much nobody wants it now, or even then. I remember when the PlayStation 3 was first coming out after the sticker shock of the century was put on stage.
The 60GB PlayStation 3 for $599 US, $659 Canadian.
Sony spent a lot of time justifying the price point with different futuristic features the console would have. One big part of this was the immersion factor from the controller itself.
I can move this controller in 6 degrees of freedom using my hands as the entire input device.
I will say when I originally saw this part of the show, it was an interesting concept. See, we were just coming off a generation where a wired controller was standard with the PS2, and third-party wireless controllers just felt off. Now, we not only have a wireless controller, but it can control things on screen without even pressing a button or moving a stick. It was that sense of next-gen without just being about the graphical upgrade, which was just obvious going from the PS2 to the PS3. The naming of what was really just gyro controls was Sony's marketing machine at work. Sixaxis, from what I can tell, refers to the 6 degrees of freedom with the 3 different axes, so not technically 6 axes. I do like the term Sixaxis, though, because spelled backwards, it's still Sixaxis. That's at least a nice touch. Either way, gyro controls being baked into controllers is something that's still around today, and in fact is preferred by many gamers in some cases like certain shooters. So this wasn't really the issue for the controller. Something else, though, was mentioned in this presentation.
Now this controller, in being Bluetooth, being wireless, is actually lighter than the analog controller shipped with PlayStation 2.
So Phil, how does it feel?
It feels incredibly intuitive, and I'm very excited not just for what this means for our game developers, but I'm so excited about what this means for the consumer and for their experience of PlayStation 3. I think it's a fantastic innovation.
Yeah, he wasn't joking. This controller is incredibly light. Now, getting the weight of a controller in that sweet spot is probably one of the hardest parts to figure out when engineering it. Think about all of the ideas you may have for different inputs or features, but only so many can be implemented before you go over a certain threshold and the controller becomes a fatigue-inducing mammoth. Make the controller too heavy and it could become uncomfortable to use in longer play sessions. In this case, though, Sony suffered from the opposite. The controller was just too light. If you want a quick weight comparison for some context here, the Sixaxis controller weighs in at just 135 grams, which is the same weight as a Wii remote with 2 AA batteries installed. Only difference here is the remote was designed to be primarily held with one hand, so you could hold the nunchuck attachment with the other. This was it, though, for the PS3 launch controller. You were just using this and nothing else. Even the PS2 controller felt more sturdy than the new flagship controller that, by the way, was being paired with the enthusiast PS3 console at launch. The plastic was also pretty thin, and you can see parts of it are even somewhat translucent. This all came together to make a controller that just felt downright cheap. You could even say it felt like a toy, which is not the direction Sony was going in with their new console. Coming off of the Xbox, GameCube, PS2 generation, consoles were really breaking into the mainstream with the PS2 taking over. Thanks to its built-in DVD player, many people who hadn't owned a game console prior now had experience with a console. Even if it was originally purchased just to watch movies, the PS3 continued this trend, baking in a Blu-ray player, making it a high-end media player at the time. It was just a massive contrast between the system and controller, but turns out this wasn't Sony's intended design. See, in the mid-90s, Immersion filed patents for technology related to rumble motors that would be used for Microsoft and Sony's consoles later on. Nintendo really wasn't affected by any of this since their designs were based on patents that they hold. In 2002, Immersion sued both Microsoft and Sony for patent infringement, which Microsoft quickly settled and then bought their way out of by literally buying 10% of the Immersion company. Sony continued fighting this lawsuit, which turned out to be a mistake in the long run since they seemed to lose over and over again in the courts. It got so bad that Sony was unable to sell controllers with rumble motors leading up to the PS3 launch and decided to remove the feature from the Sixaxis, citing the rumble motors would interfere with the motion detection of the controller. My favorite quote has to be from Phil Harrison when he said, "I believe that the Sixaxis controller offers game designers and developers far more opportunity for future innovation than Rumble ever did." Now, Rumble, I think, was the last generation feature. It's not the next generation feature. Anyway, as soon as the case was settled and Sony paid out over $100 million to Immersion, the DualShock 3 came out with both rumble and gyro. Phil Harrison, by the way, went on to help launch the Xbox One and then followed up that performance by heading the launch of Google Stadia. Good job, Phil. The Sixaxis controller was really just that, a stopgap until the case was figured out with Immersion. Just a year and a half later in 2008, once the DualShock 3 released, there was no point in getting a Sixaxis controller. Oh, and a fun side note, at one point here later in the PS2's life, because of this situation, the DualShock 2 actually lost its rumble motors, and there are many people who are unaware of that, but if you have one of those rumbleless PS2 controllers, let me know down in the comments. Here's a Sixaxis controller I did a full refurbishment on, mostly because I remember not liking the controller back when it came out, and I wanted to see if it was any different now, almost 20 years later. A lot of these controllers are absolutely destroyed in the used market. I really can't recommend taking one of these controllers apart as your first one. The PS3 controller in particular has some weird stuff going on inside that makes fitting it back together a challenge on its own. The pads, for example, on the top shoulder buttons get caught all the time when trying to close it up, and unless you get it just right, won't come together completely. Anyway, I changed out the worn thumbsticks and gave all the plastics nice cleaning, and after getting it all back together, it turns out I still don't like it. It's not bad with the form factor necessarily, since it really is just a PS2 controller without the cord. Typical PlayStation D-pad and pressure-sensitive face buttons, dual analog sticks that do feel a bit loose compared to the PS2. The center PlayStation button syncs the controller with 4 red LEDs on the top. Also, despite the numbering, the PS3 actually supports syncing up to 7 controllers to a single console. The way they would account for player numbers above 4 is by lighting up numbers that added to that player number. So for example, here, player 5 has both 1 and 4 lit up. There's a mini USB plug at the top for charging, along with the Sixaxis logo. The shoulder buttons are typical R1 and L1, but L2 and R2 were made into analog for the PS3. On the PS2, these were just single press buttons. Here, however, it can track travel. So, for example, a racing game can now track how much throttle you want to use. Unfortunately, these two buttons feel really bad to press down. I'd describe this as spongy, and it also doesn't help that the top of both curve down and away from your finger, so it's easy to lose your grip when pressing down fully. I guess the battery life is a plus here, since I don't remember having issues with it dying quickly, and in fact, Sony seems to estimate the Sixaxis controller with 30 hours of playtime. You know, I think it's mostly the PS3 controller itself I'm not as fond of, but the Sixaxis missing rumble and not even replacing it with some sort of weight inside of it didn't help matters. The DualShock 3 certainly solved this problem and just felt like a better controller overall, but when compared to the previous generation with the PS2 controller and the next generation with the DualShock 4, I would say this is a weaker time for Sony's input devices out of the box. But hey, I guess it could have been worse. Sony could have gone to market with this thing. Anyway, let me know your thoughts on the PS3 controllers, especially if you were someone who bought the Sixaxis when the PlayStation 3 first released. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.